Wake up. It's the Sleep Unplugged podcast, episode 106, Hypnosis and Insomnia. Hypnotized, mesmerized by what my eyes have found. Welcome, everyone, to the Sleep Unplugged podcast. My name is Chris Winter. I'm a neurologist, sleep specialist, and your host. For this episode that was born out of another episode of the podcast, episode 103, where we were looking at research that came out of the sleep meeting, I noticed a couple of abstracts on hypnosis and thought, that would be an interesting topic for Insomnia Monday. So it's the first Monday of July. I can't believe it. And if you're a listener of the podcast, you know that the first Monday of every month, we dedicate to some topic related to insomnia. So I thought hypnosis would be the topic. So here we are. If you're a veteran of the podcast, glad you're here. If you're new to the podcast, we're really excited to have you as part of the family. And if you watch the podcast on YouTube, we film all the episodes of our podcast. We put the video up on YouTube if you prefer to consume your content that way. And you can see I'm wearing my shirt that reminded me of hypnosis for whatever reason. So that was my outfit choice for tonight. So excited to dive into it. If you're interested in communicating with the show, you can reach us on our social media channels, Dr. Chris Winter, Instagram, Dr. Chris Winter, Twitter. Give me a follow. You can find me and direct message me if you have ideas, thoughts about the show, experience with hypnosis and sleep. Again, that's Dr. Chris Winter, Instagram, Twitter, Bluesky, Threads, TikTok. We also have a YouTube page. If you look up Sleep Unplugged Podcast on YouTube, you can find video content of all of our episodes. You can certainly interact with us through that platform as well, too. We do a Spotify playlist. We talk about a little bit of music at the beginning of each show in terms of something related to the title of the podcast. And you can find those on Spotify, Sleep Unplugged episodes, volumes 1, 2, and we just started volume 3. So comments, corrections, criticisms, I wanted to make 2. The first was we did an episode on military and sleep back in episode 101. I just wanted to draw your attention to a very interesting article that just came out in the New York Times called Pattern of Brain Damage is Pervasive in Navy SEALs Who Died by Suicide. This was an article written by Dave Phillips. And in it, he wrote that a lot of Navy SEALs were being exposed to sort of concussive effects from firing weapons, something that people never really thought about before. We think about concussive episodes with big blasts and, running over a mine in some sort of armored vehicle. But the actual, routine discharging of your rifle or your weapon is something that's relatively new. And in this article, there seemed to be evidence that the government's known about this as a potential cause of brain injury. And in it, they wrote, around the age of 40, nearly all of these military individuals started to struggle with insomnia, headaches, memory and coordination problems, depression, confusion, and sometimes rage. So just wanted to point that out. We think a lot about our military men and women serving, that this was always sort of related. Oh, this is because they have PTSD. It's all because of mood. But these, sleep symptoms that they're experiencing could actually be related to just the everyday job that they have in terms of, the infantry type of work that they do, firing their weapons, et cetera. So I thought that was really interesting. Also wanted to highlight a communication from one of our listeners who wrote, hey, I've had insomnia for 18 months now. One day I just stopped sleeping. It was very strange. And in that time, this individual's been given Lunesta. It stopped working. Then she went to gabapentin and high doses of other sleep aids and melatonin and magnesium and valerian. One doctor put her on Paxil. So it's just kind of gone on and on. She went and had a sleep study, but they said they found nothing wrong with me. So it just kind of went on and on. And so we just wanted to highlight that hopefully listening to the podcast, particularly the first Monday of every month, can give you some ideas of ways to think about your insomnia problem. And, it's interesting when, somebody says, and this is very common, I wanted to point out, I went to see a sleep specialist. They did a sleep study and said nothing was wrong. The moment you walk into the clinic and describe symptoms of insomnia, something's wrong. So maybe they didn't diagnose you with sleep apnea. But again, I just want to kind of put that out there that insomnia is a condition that as soon as somebody says to me, I am struggling with my sleep, there's something wrong. Now, it may not be an inability to sleep, like we've talked about many times. So, this individual says, I stopped sleeping 18 months ago. That's not what's happening right here. But 18 months ago, something changed with her sleep that's distressing to her. So if you're going to a place and they do a sleep study and they say, don't worry, nothing's wrong, that's not a helpful communication or intervention with your doctor. So thanks for looking up the show, and hopefully some of our episodes or my books, The Sleep Solution, might be helpful to you. Before we get going with the episode, our musical title artist is Natalie Merchant. This was from her song Carnival off her debut album, Tiger Lily, released back in 1995, one of my favorite albums. Hypnotized, Mesmerized by What My Eyes Have Found was a line from the song Carnival, which she wrote having traveled to New York City when she was 16. It was such a sensory experience that she wrote the song kind of putting herself in that position of being in the city for the very first time and all the sights, and she kind of described it like a carnival. This is one of my favorite albums, and what makes this album, I think, so great is the guitar work by Jennifer Turner. It's just the juxtaposition and the interplay between Natalie's vocals and Jennifer's guitar, I think, is just something really magical. And Natalie Merchant, of course, with 10,000 Maniacs for many years, left and had a solo career. She was heavily influenced actually by David Bowie. Somebody asked her what, album or what music inspired you the most when you were young, and she said, Ziggy Stardust. That album was one of the very first albums she bought, and she was obsessed with it. She actually judged her friends on whether or not they liked it or not. And she said, I was very harsh with my criticism of friends that didn't like that album. She said it helped her through her identity, her adolescence, helped her form her identity, and just really felt like there was something out there, from outer space. It was a message directly to her. So anyway, we'll add Carnival to our Spotify music playlist, Sleep Unplugged Volume 3, and really excited to feature Natalie Merchant in an episode. So, like I said at the onset of the show, I got interested in this topic because I was looking during the episode 103, I was looking through interesting abstracts and came across a couple of abstracts from a group comprised of individuals from University of Texas, Indiana, and what's the other? Baylor, I believe. And they were looking at the use of hypnosis in individuals with mild cognitive impairment. And we talked about sleep and dementia in episode 99. So it was really tying together a lot of really interesting episodes that we've done with the research that they were doing. And so these individuals this group actually had two abstracts in the meeting looking at the feasibility and the usefulness of using hypnosis intervention with individuals with mild cognitive impairment. Just very quickly, when you're thinking about the spectrum of dementia, mild cognitive impairment is sort of that area that exists between normal cognitive functioning and the diagnosis of mild dementia. And it's generally done through sort of neuropsychological testing, which I think is some of the best interventions that we as neurologists or even clinicians can do. If you feel like you are struggling with your memory or your cognitive abilities, going to a place that does a great job of cognitive assessments and administering that test. As neurologists, we do some generally, we have little cognitive assessments, the kind of things that the presidents are always bickering about. I did the cognitive test and passed it with flying colors. Yeah, it was probably, name 3 items, spell the word world backwards, and what's the date and day of the week that we're in. Like that's the kind of thing that's probably. So so there's lots of different cognitive assessments, and mild cognitive impairment is when somebody's starting to show signs that their cognition is not up to par with age match and education match norms. So in this study, there were it was a two-armed randomized control pilot trial that had 21 adults, so relatively small sample size. And these individuals were randomly assigned to either hypnosis audio recordings or sham hypnosis recordings for 5 weeks. I'm obsessed with sham things. Like we talked about last week with the air purification. Like, I think that's so cool. Like, one group was in, rooms with sham air purifiers. I'm so interested what the sham hypnosis would be, because you would have to create something that the individual thought potentially could be hypnotic, but wasn't. You know what I mean? Like if it's heavy metal music, you would probably think, oh, I think I'm in the sham. I think I'm in the sham group. So shams are really interesting because they have to be believable, which is why a pill's easy. This white pill versus that white pill, you really can't tell the difference. A hypnotic sort of thing. Maybe you've had experience with hypnosis versus something sham. You have to be very careful, because if the individual knows, oh, I'm in the sham group for sure here, because I'm looking at this air purifier and it's just a piece of plastic. It doesn't even have a vent. It doesn't even have a plug that plugs into the wall. If you know you're in the sham, that can influence the results. Well, anyway, so the two-armed, so you were listening to the sham or you weren't. What they found was there were significant improvements in sleep quality, sleep duration, and daytime sleepiness in the individuals who were in the real hypnosis intervention. And one of the endpoints you often see in clinical studies, if you look them up, is some sort of impression of change, like a CGI, clinical global impression of change. And that can be the evaluator, like I'm blinded. I don't know which of my patients is in the sham hypnosis group or not. And I'm being asked to say, is this person better or not? So I evaluate them and say, yeah, I think their sleep is actually significantly better. There's also impressions where the patient or the subject will tell you, I think I'm better. I don't think anything's changed. I actually think I'm worse. And so in this study, the patients themselves perceived greater benefit and impact when they were in the hypnosis group, which I think is really, really interesting. So studies have been looking at sleep and hypnosis for a very long time. The earliest case studies that I could find went back to about 1963. I found a wonderful article in 1979 from the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. This was a British journal. I think it was the Journal of Royal Society of Medicine. It was again, a British journal that I want to read something from the discussion of this study. So keep in mind, this was 79, long, long time ago. I would like to say before my time, but I can't do that and not lie to you. The study says the trial should have included more patients. Conducting a complex trial between hypnotherapies was difficult to enlist hypnotists prepared to give this intervention. A large number of patients were therefore suspicious of the hypnotherapy and declined to participate, because they felt like they would be deprived of one of the consulate the I'm having trouble. Hold on 1 second here. I'm going to start again. The trial should have included more patients. However, many difficulties are obvious in conducting a complex trial between hypnotherapy and placebo. In the first place, it was difficult to enlist hypnotists prepared to give a drug or placebo when they had already decided hypnotherapy was the treatment of choice, an ethical consideration which cannot be ignored. A large number of patients were thought to be depressed, but many more were suspicious of hypnotherapy and declined to participate. Many patients probably thought that they would be deprived of one consolation which made their lives tolerable, and refused to have their usual prescription for a hypnotic withheld. The patients treated included all those who were suitable and willing to participate in a 10-week trial, including auto hypnosis. So I think that's really interesting in that these individuals back in 1963 were already seeing problems that will persist for many decades, which are number one, hard to find people qualified to do the hypnosis. Number two, patients struggling to decide to even try it and actually enlist enough patients in these studies for it to work. Three, finding people willing to give up their pills to do hypnosis was so lots of problems when it comes to using hypnotherapy. And then the bottom line was, you know what, we really can't tell a difference one way or the other. So how do we define hypnosis? Hypnosis is one of the problems you see in a lot of these studies is there isn't a consensus of even how to define hypnosis. Some individuals consider it to be a state between consciousness and unconsciousness. And we've all been in that place, right? That hypnagogic space that you're getting ready to fall asleep and maybe you awaken and realize, oh, I was almost asleep, or I was having this kind of bizarre dream, but I didn't really think that I had fallen asleep yet. But I think some of my thoughts might be illustrating the fact that I was in a state that wasn't fully awake, or watching a television show. And then you go back and rewind and realize, wow, I missed this entire section, but I thought I was awake watching this whole show. I've been watching the show Servant on Apple TV, and that exact thing happened. My wife said, here's where we're at. I'm like, oh, honey, we've watched this episode. I said, but I don't care. Like, we can watch it again. I don't want you to, not know what's going on. So let's rewind it and watch the episode again. And I'll just, do some work while we're watching it because I've already seen it. Well, there was a big section of that episode. I was like, wait a minute, who's that person? I don't realize what's going on here. And I don't remember all these bugs crawling around the house. So anyway, so I think that is, one definition. Another definition is just a form of relaxation. And we've talked a lot about that on this show. So I think as you start to look at some of the research around hypnosis and insomnia, it kind of starts to have a feeling of breath work and relaxation techniques and resting as our goal, not necessarily sleep as our goal. So I think that, and then, there's the definitions that involve, some sort of direct or indirect suggestion. But I think that the failure of all of these different studies to define hypnosis is sort of a problem looking at this as a practical tool for the treatment of insomnia. So when somebody is hypnotized, what does that even look like? What are some signs that an individual is in a state of hypnosis? And I found these to be fascinating. The first is relaxation. One of the ones that's commonly seen throughout the literature is salivation. And I kind of have this idea of a person being somewhat hypnotized, mouth open, and they're drooling a little bit. So they're kind of in that state of almost looking dumbstruck, when you're kind of, oh my God, your mouth's open, drool's coming out. So perhaps, a relaxation of the face to the point where you might be drooling a little bit. Numb fingers, lack of facial expression, hand and eye paralysis. There's actually studies looking at hypnosis and trying to test people in terms of whether they're hypnotized, losing needle prick perception. So pricking somebody on the finger, and when somebody's fully awake and conscious, they might withdraw or have a reaction to the needle prick. The hypnotized patient doesn't. And one was arm cataplexy, which I thought was really interesting. So we've talked about cataplexy in our episodes about narcolepsy, which is that sudden loss of muscle tone. We often think of full body cataplexy, but for a lot of individuals with narcolepsy, that cataplexy involves their arms or upper body, shoulder girdle, even their head, so that sitting in class and your head nods or you're dropping your pencil, as a sign of cataplexy. One study kind of used that as surrogate. So how do you actually design some of these studies? What do the studies look like? So there have been attempts to look at the role of hypnotherapy or hypnosis within sleep. There was a 2015 Chinese study entitled Hypnotherapy for Insomnia, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled studies. There was also, I believe, there was a 2022 study entitled Hypnotherapy and Insomnia, Narrative Review of the Literature. I believe that was a French study. And in that study, they found 208 articles related to sleep, hypnosis, insomnia. 204 were included in the initial evaluation. And at the end, they kept 55 articles were selected, and then 25 made the final analysis. So that's very common when you actually look at these literature reviews, that they're looking for the best, most representative studies. And when you looked at both the 2015 Chinese review as well as the 2022, it sounds very much like the 1979 article that we read. The studies are too small. The definitions of the definitions of hypnosis are too varied. There's not a great consensus as to how to even determine whether or not somebody is hypnotized or not. And then the studies aren't particularly well powered or designed to show an effect. So neither one of the review studies actually indicated that they thought hypnosis at this point had shown itself to be a useful tool for the treatment of insomnia. Now, once again, there is a difference between studies showing that something does not work and studies basically saying we don't really have great studies one way or the other to prove that it's working or not. We can't say based upon what we've got, which is why it's really exciting for this group out of Baylor. I'm going to name them really quick. Gary Elkins, Victor Padilla, Juliet Ott, Keith Sanford, Jared Benge, Alan Stevens, Michael Scullen, Christopher Corlett, and Vindya Elanyaki. This is the group that basically put that abstract in at Houston. And so, the only way we're going to figure out how good hypnosis can be is if we start getting more and more research, more and more subjects enrolled in these types of studies. There are some, in addition to that group doing research on hypnosis in individuals with mild cognitive impairment, there have been other studies looking at hypnosis in other subpopulations related to sleep. There was a 2020 study entitled Self-Hypnosis for Sleep Disturbances in Menopausal Women. I think episode 3 we did on sleep and menopause, because as I have lamented many times on this podcast, when I wrote my first book, The Sleep Solution, it was too large and it had to be edited. And they said, what do you think would be a good thing to take out of your book? And so we took out all the pediatric stuff. It later became the book, The Rested Child. And they said, well, we still need to kind of pare it down a little bit because it's massive. And I said, well, maybe we should take out the stuff on sleep and menopause. I don't think anybody would really, mind that. And that was a huge mistake. I've gotten so many people who've said, do you write about sleep and menopause in your book, The Sleep Solution? And the answer is no, which is why it was episode 3 of our podcast, because I really wanted to make sure that we covered it, because I think it's a huge topic. It's an emerging topic. And in this study, it was 90 women were enrolled, and they were sort of in a program that used hypnosis as part of the therapy. There was a significant reduction in their poor sleep quality in all groups, with a significant increase in minutes slept in all groups. The majority of women also showed clinical improvement in terms of their sleep duration. There was clinically meaningful improvement in reducing the perception. There again, the patients were basically displaying better quality sleep. But when you ask them, hey, is this hypnosis helping you? I think 50 to 77% of women reported improvement across the time of this study. So at least in this particular study, this 2020 study, the hypnosis showed favorable improvement in these women related to sleep and menopausal symptoms. There was also a study in 2006 looking at children. It was Hypnosis for Treatment of Insomnia in School-Aged Children, a retrospective chart review. In this study, it basically said, look, younger children are more likely to report that insomnia was related to fear. 2 or fewer hypnosis sessions were provided to 68% of the patients in this population. Of the 70 patients reporting a delay in sleep onset of more than 30 minutes, 90% of those patients reported a reduction in sleep onset time following hypnosis. So a massive improvement with these children as it relates to difficulty falling asleep quickly, fears before you go to bed. Of the 21 patients reporting nighttime awakenings, that's always my fear, right? As a parent, like you're asleep and then you kind of wake up and your kid's just standing next to you in the bed. Like that to me is very terrifying, right out of The Servant and M. Night Shyamalan. I see sleepless children. 52% reported resolution of the awakenings and 38% reported improvement. Somatic complaints were reduced by about 41%. And among the patients, 87% reported improvement or resolution of somatic complaints following hypnosis. So, coughing, headaches, bad tummy, all these little somatic complaints that kids have related to sleep, vast majority showed improvement with hypnosis. So this is not something I've ever prescribed to a patient. I don't know who in my area would do it or who would be reputable to do it, but it's certainly a way to sort of encourage adults and children who may be struggling with sleep to improve. So what are some techniques for hypnosis? So, hey, Chris, this is great. I've tried a lot of things like our person at the top of the show. How do you do it? And, I was looking up techniques for hypnosis and they're really all over the place. And the first one that I came upon over and over again was just relaxation. That I think hypnosis is really built upon a technique of relaxation, which is why when you look at that reporting of the improvements in children, my guess is it's really pretty viable option because as that child gets ready to go to bed at night, fears of the dark, fears of people in their closet, fear of a monster underneath their bed, what fear of waking up in the dark and mommy and daddy aren't there, that you're using a technique that's primarily based upon relaxation. So you can understand why, particularly in children, it can be very effective. So one technique is to imagine yourself radiating warmth or creating heaviness within your body. You're getting heavier and heavier. Feel your arms getting heavier. They're so heavy that you can't lift them off the bed. And your body, feel the heat radiating from the middle part of your body, expanding outward. You can feel your shoulders getting heavy and warm and your elbows getting heavy and warm. So it's kind of creating that sense of grounding, a sense of stability, warmth, that kind of cocoon feeling. And again, you might be thinking, well, this reminds me of things I do in my yoga class or things I do in my meditation. Maybe there's religious practices that you might feel with this, mindfulness practices. I think all of these things. I was just at a museum, the Ringling Museum in Sarasota did a big conference on wonder and awe, had an amazing speaker, Erin Clabo, who's a professor at the University of Virginia. And it was interesting how she kind of brought everything together, wonder and awe, mindfulness, meditation, all these things kind of together. So I think there's quite a spectrum there. Visualizing a pleasant place is often a technique used for hypnosis. Getting into bed and imagining yourself in your vacation home or your dream home, or maybe a place where you vacation as a kid that you have really happy memories about. Focalization techniques, behavioral techniques, dissociative techniques, age regression. Imagine yourself as a child. You're going back to your childhood. This is a very common way for individuals to be hypnotized. And then there's this sort of the focal. I want you to imagine, focus on this light, focus on this candle, and really put all of your thoughts and energy into that sort of focus, that strong focus is a way into a more meditative state, which I think a lot of people do. I kind of feel like I do these things as I go to bed. Like I often think of pleasant places and pleasant memories and use that almost as a sandbox. And you can sometimes get that sense as you're moving into that, imagining yourself in that positive place and around people, that you start to kind of lose that strong connection to reality and maybe start to enter more dreamlike cycles. And, we did an episode on lucid dreaming about a year ago where we talked about lucid dreaming techniques. I think there's a lot of similarities to that as well too. And stay tuned because we're about to have our lucid dreaming episode where we're all going to try to lucid dream ourselves to a place. I'll be holding an object, and it'll be your job to tell me what I'm holding. So I want to wrap up this episode with a quotation from a 2008 paper. It was a Singapore study on hypnosis that said hypnosis is a specialized technique, not a therapy itself, and should be used as an adjunctive intervention within a complete psychological and medical treatment package. Most of the literature is limited to case reports or studies with such as a small sample that at times it is very difficult to interpret the results. There is a major placebo effect, so uncontrolled trials are of limited value. It is hard to perform a randomized, double-blind, controlled trial to evaluate hypnotherapy, given that cooperation and rapport between the patient and therapist is needed to achieve a receptive trance state. So once again, that sham trance state, that sham hypnotherapy is not hard to distinguish between the real thing, I think. So I'm curious if any of you have ever tried hypnotherapy, if you know of resources that provide it. I think right now the jury's out, but it's certainly something that could be, evaluated and played with in a way to get yourself to a place where you're more receptive to sleep and in a better place to achieve it. So that's it. Thanks very much for listening. I'd really appreciate your feedback. You can get in touch with us through Instagram, Dr. Chris Winter. Give me a follow. If you have time, give us a review of our podcast. We really appreciate them. I think we've gotten 54 reviews, and they're just overwhelmingly positive and very meaningful. If you have any comments, corrections, criticisms, please let us know about that as well, too. Take a listen to the Spotify playlist. We're on volume 3. If you're interested in the music of the podcast, if you want a trucker hat, let me know, $25, and we'll send you one out. And until next week, sleep well.